There is a pattern that often goes unnoticed, not because it is rare, but because it hides in plain sight. It shows up in the way someone says, "I'm fine," a little too quickly, in the way they brush off concern before it fully arrives, in the way they carry things quietly until the weight becomes almost unbearable. Many people develop the habit of handling everything alone, not as a conscious decision, but as something that slowly becomes automatic over time. They minimize what they feel, downplay what they are going through, and convince themselves that it is not serious enough to share. Even when support is available, something inside them hesitates. Reaching out is not the first instinct. It is often the last resort, something considered only when the situation becomes overwhelming and impossible to manage alone. From the outside, this can look like strength, independence, or emotional control. People may even admire it, interpreting it as resilience or maturity. But beneath that surface, the pattern is rarely about confidence or self-sufficiency. It is something much quieter and more deeply rooted. It is a learned response, shaped by experiences where asking for help did not feel safe, welcome, or reliable. At some point, whether through subtle emotional signals or more direct experiences, the mind begins to associate need with risk. Perhaps support was inconsistent, or vulnerability was met with discomfort, dismissal, or distance. Perhaps the person learned that expressing need created tension, or that relying on others led to disappointment. The brain, designed to protect, takes these experiences seriously. It does not question whether they apply forever, it simply adapts. Over time, it builds a system that prioritizes self-containment over connection, control over uncertainty, silence over exposure. This is why the habit becomes so persistent. It is not driven by logic in the present moment, but by emotional memory stored in the nervous system. Even when circumstances change, even when safe and supportive people are present, the old pattern remains. The body tightens before the words can come out. The mind finds reasons to stay quiet. It says, "It's not that bad," or "I can handle this," or "I don't want to bother anyone." These thoughts feel true, but they are often protective rather than accurate. What is happening is not a refusal of support, but a learned distance from it. The person is not rejecting others, they are protecting themselves from a risk that once felt very real. Understanding this changes everything. It shifts the perspective from judgment to awareness, from self-criticism to compassion. Because this pattern is not a flaw in character, and it is not a sign of weakness, it is the result of adaptation, of a mind that learned early on that managing things alone was the safest option available. And once something becomes associated with safety, it is not easily unlearned. What often gets misunderstood about the inability to ask for help is the assumption that it reflects personality, something fixed, intentional, or even flawed. People are labeled as too independent, emotionally closed, or bad at opening up, as if these patterns were conscious choices or inherent traits. But psychology offers a very different explanation. This behavior is not rooted in personality, it is rooted in protection. It is a pattern shaped over time, built quietly through repeated experiences that taught the brain something important. Support is not always safe, consistent, or available. In early life, the mind is highly adaptive. It does not analyze situations in a detached, logical way. Instead, it learns through emotional experience, especially in environments where responses to need are unpredictable or insufficient. If a child reaches out and is met with inconsistency, dismissal, or emotional distance, the brain begins to form associations. Not as clear, conscious beliefs, but as subtle internal rules. Needing others may lead to discomfort, disappointment, or disconnection. Over time, these rules become embedded in the nervous system. The brain, whose primary function is survival, begins to prioritize strategies that reduce risk. And one of the most effective strategies it discovers is simple: rely on yourself. This is not because self-reliance is always ideal, but because it is predictable. It removes the uncertainty that comes with depending on others. As this pattern repeats, it solidifies into a long-term behavioral defense. The person becomes someone who manages internally, processes privately, and avoids placing emotional weight on others. Importantly, this adaptation is not irrational. It makes complete sense given the environment in which it was formed. The brain is not trying to isolate the individual. It is trying to protect them from potential harm. The difficulty is that these patterns do not automatically update when circumstances change. Even in safe, supportive environments later in life, the original programming remains active. The nervous system continues to respond as if help is still uncertain or risky. This is why the struggle to ask for support can feel so automatic and difficult to override. It is not a lack of willingness or awareness, but a deeply ingrained protective mechanism operating beneath conscious thought. Understanding this reframes the entire experience. It moves the narrative away from self-blame and toward recognition of how intelligently the mind adapted under pressure. What looks like distance is often protection. What looks like independence is often a learned response to instability. And what feels like a personal limitation is, in reality, a survival strategy that once made perfect sense. One of the deepest and most influential traits in people who struggle to ask for help is the quiet belief that their needs are a burden. This belief rarely forms through a single moment. It is not usually the result of something obvious or explicitly stated. Instead, it develops gradually through small, repeated experiences that seem insignificant on the surface, but carry emotional weight over time. A sigh that followed a question, a delayed response when comfort was needed, a subtle shift in tone that suggested irritation rather than care, or a moment when emotional closeness was replaced with distance. None of these experiences may have been extreme enough to stand out on their own, but together they create a pattern that the mind begins to recognize. And the brain, especially in early development, is highly sensitive to patterns. It does not need clear explanations to form conclusions. It absorbs, adapts, and protects. Over time, these subtle signals begin to shape an internal narrative, one that is rarely spoken out loud, but deeply felt. My needs make things harder for other people. Once this belief takes hold, it does not remain confined to childhood. It follows the individual into every future interaction, quietly influencing how they relate to others. Asking for help no longer feels neutral or natural. It begins to feel like something that must be justified, minimized, or avoided altogether. Even when support is offered freely, something inside resists fully accepting it. There is often a sense of discomfort, even shame, as if receiving care requires repayment or explanation. This is why many people with this trait tend to downplay what they are going through. They share only the lighter version of their struggles, keeping the heavier parts hidden. They become skilled at appearing composed, at managing their emotions privately, at carrying more than they should without letting it show. From the outside, this can look like strength or emotional stability. Others may see them as easygoing, low maintenance, or independent. But beneath that surface, there is often a quiet tension, a constant effort to ensure that their presence does not create inconvenience for anyone else. This can lead to a pattern of silent endurance, where pain is processed alone and needs are consistently pushed aside. Over time, this pattern becomes exhausting, but it is difficult to break because it is tied to a deeper fear, the fear of being unwanted. If asking for something risks creating distance or discomfort, then not asking begins to feel like the safer option. And so, the person learns to carry more than they should, not because they want to suffer alone, but because their nervous system has come to associate need with rejection. Understanding this trait is important because it reveals that the behavior is not about weakness or lack of confidence. It is about adaptation. It is about a mind that learned, through experience, that minimizing its own needs was the best way to maintain connection. And while that strategy may have once served a purpose, it often continues long after the original conditions have changed, shaping a way of being that prioritizes others at the cost of oneself. Another defining trait in people who struggle to ask for help is an unusually strong reliance on themselves, a form of independence that did not develop simply as a preference, but as a necessity. These individuals often learned early in life how to cope without consistent support. They became resourceful, observant, and capable, not because it was encouraged in a healthy way, but because there were moments when there was no other option. When problems arose, they handled them. When emotions surfaced, they managed them privately. When things became overwhelming, they endured rather than reached outward. Over time, this repeated pattern shaped a powerful internal belief: I can only truly rely on myself. From the outside, this kind of self-reliance is often admired. It looks like resilience, maturity, and emotional strength. People may see someone who is dependable, composed under pressure, and able to navigate difficulties without falling apart. But what is less visible is the cost that comes with it. When reliance on oneself becomes the primary strategy for survival, trusting others does not develop naturally. It begins to feel unfamiliar, even unsafe. Accepting help is no longer a simple act. It becomes something that requires vulnerability, surrender of control, and the willingness to depend on another person's consistency. For someone whose experience has taught them that consistency is uncertain, this can feel like a significant risk. Questions arise internally, often without being fully conscious. Will they understand what I'm going through? Will they judge me for it? Will they show up when it actually matters, or disappear when things become difficult? These uncertainties create hesitation, even when support is offered genuinely and without conditions. As a result, many self-reliant individuals default to handling things alone, even when they are exhausted or overwhelmed. They may say, "It's okay, I've got it," not because they truly feel okay, but because that response feels safer than depending on someone else. Control, in this context, becomes more comfortable than care. There is a predictability in self-reliance that external support cannot always guarantee. This is why even when help does arrive, it does not immediately feel relieving. The body may remain tense, the mind alert, as if waiting for something to go wrong. Receiving support can trigger a subtle discomfort, a feeling that it needs to be repaid or justified rather than simply accepted. This reaction is not coldness or emotional distance. It is the result of a nervous system that has learned to associate safety with self-sufficiency. Over time, this creates a paradox. The more capable a person becomes at handling things alone, the harder it becomes to let others in. Not because they do not need support, but because the pathway to receiving it has never felt fully safe or familiar. What began as an adaptive strength slowly turns into a limitation, not in ability, but in connection. Understanding this trait helps shift the perspective away from seeing self-reliance as purely positive or purely negative. It is both a strength and a defense, a skill built from experience that deserves recognition, but also awareness. Because true strength is not only the ability to stand alone, but also the ability to trust when it is safe to do so. For many people who struggle to ask for help, the difficulty does not begin with the request itself, but with what the request represents. Beneath the simple act of saying, "I need help," lies something far more exposed: vulnerability. It is the moment of being seen without protection, without control, without the ability to manage how one is perceived. And for individuals with certain emotional histories, that level of visibility does not feel neutral, it feels dangerous. This association rarely forms without reason. It is usually built through past experiences where opening up did not lead to safety, but to discomfort, dismissal, or subtle invalidation. Perhaps emotions were minimized, compared, or misunderstood. Perhaps moments of honesty were met with silence instead of support, or with responses that made the individual feel too much, too sensitive, or plus not important enough to be taken seriously. Over time, the mind begins to connect vulnerability with pain, not as an abstract idea, but as something deeply encoded in the nervous system. So when the thought of asking for help arises later in life, the reaction is not simply about seeking support. It triggers an internal alert system. The brain recalls, without needing conscious awareness, that exposure once led to discomfort or rejection. As a result, asking for help no longer feels like reaching out. It feels like stepping into uncertainty without protection. This is why many people with this trait develop a strong outward composure. They appear calm, stable, and in control, even when internally they are processing complex emotions. They become highly functional, able to manage responsibilities and navigate challenges without visibly breaking down. But this external stability often comes at the cost of internal isolation. Emotions are felt deeply, but processed privately. Struggles are endured silently, and moments of vulnerability are carefully contained rather than shared. From the outside, others may interpret this as strength or emotional independence. They may say, "You always seem fine," or "You never show when something is wrong." What they do not see is the internal calculation constantly taking place. Opening up is not a simple decision, it is a risk assessment. Will it be safe this time? Will I be understood? Or will I feel exposed again? And because past experiences have shaped the answer to that question, the safest option often becomes silence. This creates a pattern where connection is limited not by a lack of desire, but by a learned association between vulnerability and harm. The individual may deeply want support, understanding, and closeness, but the pathway to those things feels blocked by the fear of what might happen if they are fully seen. Over time, this leads to a life where emotional depth exists, but is rarely shared in its full form. The person becomes someone who can handle almost anything alone, not because they prefer isolation, but because it feels safer than the alternative. Understanding this trait is essential because it reveals that the issue is not an inability to connect, but a protective response to past experiences. The mind is not trying to prevent closeness, it is trying to prevent pain. And until vulnerability is no longer associated with danger, asking for help will continue to feel like stepping into something uncertain rather than reaching towards something supportive. Another deeply rooted trait in people who struggle to ask for help is the quiet belief that their pain is theirs alone to carry. This belief does not usually form through explicit teaching, but through experience, particularly in environments where emotional responsibility was taken on too early. Some individuals grow up in situations where they become the calm one, the understanding one, the one who does not add to the existing tension. They learn to read the emotional atmosphere of a room, to sense when others are already overwhelmed, and to adjust themselves accordingly. In those moments, a silent decision is often made. My feelings can wait. My needs are not as urgent. I should handle this on my own. Over time, this pattern becomes automatic. It is no longer a conscious choice, but a default way of responding to discomfort. When something hurts, the instinct is not to reach outward, but to contain it, to reduce it, to make it smaller before anyone else has to notice. This creates an internal dialogue that runs quietly in the background. Other people have it worse. It's not that serious. I should be able to deal with this. I don't want to burden anyone. These thoughts feel reasonable, even responsible, but they are often rooted in a deeper sense of guilt around needing support at all. The individual begins to feel that asking for help is not just unnecessary, but inappropriate, that their struggles do not qualify for attention or care. What makes this pattern particularly complex is that it often exists in people who are highly compassionate toward others. They are the ones who show up without hesitation, who listen, who support, who make space for other people's emotions without judgment. They can recognize pain in others quickly and respond with patience and understanding. But when it comes to themselves, the same compassion does not apply. The standards change. Their own needs are questioned, minimized, or dismissed before anyone else has the chance to respond. This creates a kind of emotional imbalance where care flows outward easily but struggles to return inward. Over time, this dynamic becomes exhausting. The person continues to give, to support, to hold space for others, while quietly carrying their own weight alone. From the outside, they may appear strong, dependable, and emotionally stable. But internally, there is often a sense of isolation, not because others are unavailable, but because the person has learned not to include themselves in the circle of care. This is the painful irony of the pattern. The more someone is capable of caring for others, the less they may feel entitled to receive that same care. Understanding this trait shifts the perspective in an important way. It reveals that the behavior is not selfish or avoidant, but deeply rooted in early adaptation. It is the result of learning, often at a young age, that maintaining emotional balance in a space meant minimizing one's own needs. And while that strategy may have once helped preserve connection or reduce conflict, it often continues long after it is necessary, shaping a life where pain is endured privately rather than shared. For many people who struggle to ask for help, independence is not simply something they do, it is something they are. Over time, what began as a coping strategy slowly transforms into identity, shaping how they see themselves and how they believe they are seen by others. They become the strong one, the reliable one, the person who handles things without needing much from anyone else. This identity is often reinforced by external feedback. They may have been praised for being mature, admired for being self-sufficient, or relied upon in ways that made their strength feel valuable and necessary. In environments where support was inconsistent or emotional needs were overlooked, this role may have been one of the few ways to feel secure, respected, or even noticed. As a result, independence is no longer just a practical approach, it becomes tied to self-worth. The idea of needing help begins to conflict with the identity they have built. If they are the one who holds everything together, what happens when they cannot? If they are the one others rely on, what does it mean if they need to rely on someone else? These questions are rarely spoken out loud, but they operate quietly beneath the surface, shaping behavior in powerful ways. Asking for help is no longer just a decision, it feels like a contradiction. It creates an internal tension, as if stepping outside of that role risks losing something essential about who they are. This is why, even in moments of exhaustion, when the need for support is clear, many people continue to stay in character. They push through, they manage, they contain. They may hope that someone will notice without them having to say anything, but they rarely make the request directly. Because doing so feels less like an act of self-care and more like a disruption of identity. This creates a form of isolation that is difficult to recognize from the outside. Others may see someone who is capable, composed, and dependable without realizing how much effort it takes to maintain that image. Internally, there can be a quiet longing for support, for relief, for the simple experience of not having to carry everything alone. But that longing often remains unexpressed, held back by the belief that needing help is incompatible with being strong. Over time, this pattern reinforces itself. The more someone continues to function independently, the more their identity solidifies around that role, and the harder it becomes to step outside of it. What began as adaptation becomes expectation, both from within and from others. This is the hidden cost of independence when it becomes identity. It provides a sense of control, stability, and recognition, but it also limits connection. It makes support feel unnecessary at best and threatening at worst, even when it is freely available. Understanding this trait is important because it reveals that the issue is not a lack of strength, but an over-identification with it. True independence is flexible. It allows for both self-reliance and connection. But when independence becomes rigid, when it defines worth and identity, it can prevent a person from accessing the very support that could help them feel less alone. And in that space, strength stops being a resource and starts becoming a barrier, not because it is wrong, but because it is no longer balanced. What often looks like strength on the surface is not always built from peace, but from necessity. Many people who appear resilient, composed, and highly independent did not arrive at that state through comfort or choice, but through repeated situations where they had no other option but to adapt. They learned to stay steady when things felt unstable, to keep going when support was uncertain, and to manage their inner world without relying on anyone else. Over time, this becomes what others recognize as strength. It is admired, respected, even envied. But beneath that appearance, there is often a different story, one where resilience was not something freely developed, but something required in order to cope. This is what can be understood as defensive independence. It is not the kind of independence that comes from confidence and security, but the kind that forms as protection against disappointment, inconsistency, or emotional absence. It serves a purpose. It keeps the individual functioning, stable, and capable, even in difficult conditions. But it also comes with a cost that is not always immediately visible. When independence is shaped by survival, it tends to prioritize control over connection. Relying on oneself feels predictable and safe, while relying on others feels uncertain and potentially risky. As a result, the person may gradually limit how much they allow others to support them, not because support is unavailable, but because trusting it does not feel natural. This creates a subtle distance in relationships. They may still care deeply, still show up for others, still maintain connections, but there is often a layer that remains protected, untouched. Emotional safety becomes something that is maintained internally rather than built collaboratively with others. Over time, this can make connection feel incomplete. Trust becomes difficult, not because of a lack of willingness, but because the nervous system has learned to associate closeness with unpredictability. The person may want support, may even recognize its value intellectually, but emotionally, it does not feel fully accessible. This is the hidden cost of strength built from survival. It allows a person to endure, to function, and to succeed in many areas of life. But it can also limit their ability to experience ease, to feel supported without tension, and to trust without hesitation. Understanding this distinction is important because it reframes strength in a more nuanced way. It shows that resilience is real and valuable, but also that not all forms of independence are the same. Some are rooted in security and choice, while others are rooted in protection and adaptation. And recognizing that difference creates space for something new, not the loss of strength, but the possibility of expanding it to include connection, trust, and emotional safety alongside self-reliance. One of the most important realizations in understanding this pattern is also one of the most freeing. You were not born this way. The difficulty you feel around asking for help, the instinct to handle everything alone, the hesitation that appears even when support is available, these are not fixed traits or flaws in your personality. They are learned responses, shaped over time by the environments you moved through and the experiences that taught your mind what was safe and what was not. Early in life, the brain is not concerned with accuracy as much as it is with protection. It observes, it absorbs, and it adapts. If needing support was met with inconsistency, discomfort, or emotional distance, the mind does not question whether that pattern is universal. It simply learns that needing less is safer than needing more. And so, you begin to adjust. You ask for less, expect less, rely less, not because you do not have needs, but because expressing them did not feel secure. Over time, these adjustments become automatic. They no longer feel like choices, but like part of who you are. This is why the pattern can feel so deeply ingrained. It operates beneath conscious awareness, guiding behavior in ways that seem natural but are actually rooted in past adaptation. Understanding this changes the narrative in a fundamental way. It removes the idea that there is something inherently wrong with you, something broken or incapable. Instead, it reveals a mind that learned quickly, adapted intelligently, and protected itself in the best way it knew how. What once felt like a personal limitation begins to make sense as a survival strategy. And with that understanding comes the possibility of change. Because what is learned can also be unlearned, not by force or by becoming someone entirely different, but by gradually creating new experiences of safety, consistency, and support. When the nervous system begins to recognize that help can exist without harm, that vulnerability can be met with care rather than rejection, the old patterns start to loosen. This process is not immediate, and it does not erase the past, but it opens a door that was previously closed. It allows for a shift from self-blame to self-understanding, from judgment to compassion. And in that space, something new becomes possible, not the loss of independence, but the freedom to choose when to carry things alone and when to let someone else share the weight. The final shift in this pattern does not come from forcing yourself to become someone completely different, nor from rejecting the strength you have built over time. It begins with a quieter realization. Strength and support are not opposites. They can exist together. For many people who have lived in hyper-independence, the idea of receiving help feels like losing control, like stepping away from the identity that kept them stable for so long. But true strength is not measured by how much you can carry alone. It is measured by flexibility, the ability to stand on your own when needed, and to lean on others when it is safe to do so. Healing does not require you to abandon your independence. That independence is real, and it was built for a reason. It helped you navigate uncertainty, manage difficulty, and survive moments where support was not guaranteed. The goal is not to undo that, but to expand it, to create a version of strength that includes trust, connection, and the ability to receive without feeling exposed or ashamed. This process begins with understanding, not force. You do not heal by pushing yourself to suddenly open up, or by criticizing yourself for finding it difficult. In fact, pressure often reinforces the very defenses you are trying to soften. Instead, healing starts with recognizing why these patterns exist, seeing them not as flaws, but as intelligent adaptations that once served a purpose. When you approach yourself with that level of clarity and compassion, something begins to shift internally. The resistance becomes less rigid, the fear less overwhelming. Slowly, the nervous system begins to learn that not every moment of vulnerability leads to harm, that support can be consistent, that care can exist without conditions. This shift does not happen all at once. It happens in small, often subtle moments. Allowing yourself to admit when something feels difficult, accepting help without immediately trying to repay it, letting someone see a slightly more honest version of what you are going through. Each of these moments may feel uncomfortable at first, but they create new experiences that begin to challenge the old associations. Over time, these experiences accumulate, and the mind starts to update its understanding of what is safe. You begin to realize that connection does not have to come at the cost of your identity, that needing support does not make you less capable, and that being strong does not mean being alone. In fact, some of the strongest people are those who can hold both self-reliance and openness, independence and trust. This is what creates a more stable and sustainable form of strength, one that is not built solely on endurance, but on balance. You are still capable, you are still resilient, but now you are also allowed to be supported, and in that balance, something changes. Life becomes less about surviving through everything alone and more about moving through it with a sense of shared weight, where connection is not a risk to avoid, but a resource you can begin, slowly and safely, to trust.